Good morning. My name is Giuseppe Nesi. I'm the Dean of the Law School, and as Dean of the Law School, I like to welcome the participants in this meeting. I would also like to say a few words about the GTR16, Trento Days on Rhetoric. Many years ago, Maurizio Manzin told me, when we were maybe researchers at that time, that he wanted to do something that, of course, was going to be important for his discipline, but at the same time would have had a certain degree of interest also for other disciplines going well beyond law. I didn't expect today that he was going to organize, together with Federico and his crew, a meeting on images and literature. I understand that this is really something that matters today. I'm not, of course, an expert in legal argumentation, neither in images or literature, but as a normal people, I appreciate very much the power of images and the new strength that, thanks to these means of communication that are around us, we have to take into account in our everyday life. I would like just to, so I do not comment upon what you are going to say. I think it will be very, very interesting to know more about how these issues will mix together and how multimodal argumentation, pluralism, and images will be dealt with during these today's meeting. But I think that we are all aware of the power of images, and I was going through one of the abstracts that have been presented, and I saw, for instance, that one of the images, of the strong images that are going to be commented upon, is the photograph of a dead Syrian toddler who lost his life in Turkey in last September. This is a very important example of how our life can change after looking at certain images. I'm sure that that image brought not only great emotions among those who saw it, but produced also important political decisions by our leaders concerning the absolute necessity to take seriously care of one of the most moving phenomena of everyday life, that of migration. Our university has devoted a lot of energy and resources to the study of this issue, but sometimes I'm sure that much more than studies and observations and doctrinal reconstructions is given by images. So I thank very much Maurizio for having chosen this topic, and with the apologies for the fact that I cannot be here for the whole time. I have a plane that is waiting for me, but I wanted to be here today just to say welcome to you. I wish you 2 days of very productive conference. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. I bring you the greetings of the Italian Society of Philosophy of Law and of the Italian Society for Law and Literature. Proseguo parlando in italiano? Ok, va bene. Dunque, la Società Italiana di Diritto e Letteratura, come tutti probabilmente sapete, è nata presso un centro interdipartimentale di ricerca dell'Università di Bologna nel 2008 per iniziativa di Enrico Pattaro, e nel 2013 si è trasformata da società in network, con però i medesimi fini, che sono quelli indicati nell'articolo 2 dello Statuto: promuovere e incoraggiare gli studi di Law and Humanities, quindi la categoria più ampia all'interno della quale si colloca diritto alla letteratura, diritto al cinema, diritto a musica, diritto a arte e così via; sostenere e incoraggiare la ricerca in questi settori, facilitando anche i rapporti con gli studiosi stranieri e la partecipazione italiana a congressi a livello internazionale. In questi 8 anni abbiamo cercato, devo dire grazie all'infaticabile lavoro di Paola Mittica, che ringrazio profondamente, abbiamo cercato di portare avanti questi vari compiti. Per quanto riguarda i rapporti internazionali, ormai in 3 convegni della IVR, cioè della Società Internazionale dei Filosofi del Diritto, sono stati previsti dei seminari degli workshop di diritto e letteratura, il primo a Pechino nel 2009, il secondo a Belo Horizonte nel 2013, l'anno scorso a Washington, e stiamo preparando il prossimo workshop per il convegno mondiale di Istanbul il prossimo anno. Per quanto riguarda invece l'attività che abbiamo svolto in Italia, devo dire che principalmente ha riguardato l'organizzazione di alcuni incontri, prima annualmente, adesso biennali. Il primo incontro si è tenuto nel 2009 a Bologna, con un titolo molto ampio, quindi diritto e letteratura, le vie della ricerca, e in quell'occasione, quindi mi fa piacere ricordarlo qui, abbiamo avuto il piacere di avere appunto con noi una delle grandi figure di diritto e letteratura a livello mondiale, Jerome Brunner, che ci ha lasciato qualche giorno fa, il 5 di giugno, ha quasi 101 anni. E devo dire, quando nel 2009 è venuto a Bologna, Paolo e gli altri lo ricorderanno bene, persona di una lucidità che ha stupito veramente tutti. La seconda conferenza sempre a Bologna, diritto e narrazioni, abbiamo avuto come ospite Boyd White. La terza conferenza a Tor Vergata, la misura del diritto. La quarta, il contributo alla formazione giuridica presso l'Università del Sannio, organizzato dal professor Vespasiani, che vedo qui. La quinta a Torino nel 2013, il diritto tra testi e immagini. La sesta nel 2014 ad Urbino, appunto, la vita nelle forme, il diritto e le altre arti. E questo settimo, diciamo, incontro qui a Trento, organizzato una sorta di joint venture con le giornate tridentine di retorica. E mi fa molto piacere, voglio dire, ricordare che le prime esperienze di diritto e letteratura sono state proprio in questa università. Nel 2004 è uscito un libro, proprio Droit Literature, edito, curato dai colleghi Marchetto e Cau, e nel 2005-2006, grazie appunto agli sforzi degli storici del diritto medievale e moderno, in particolare del professor Quaglioni, il primo corso di curricolare, quindi di diritto e letteratura. E non posso non ricordare, circa negli stessi anni, i primi seminari su diritto e cinema organizzati dalla professoressa Pederzini. Qual è? In questi anni abbiamo cercato con la ISLL anche di monitorare un po' come appunto gli insegnamenti di diritto e letteratura si sono sviluppati nelle università italiane. E uno dei primi interessi è quello che nasce proprio nell'ambito della filosofia del diritto, quindi non mi meraviglia, voglio dire, di vedere presenti oggi vari filosofi del diritto, e per questo sono molto lieta di portare anche il saluto della Società Italiana di Filosofia del Diritto, perché appunto un primo interesse, diciamo, per questa disciplina si sviluppa a Milano, grazie appunto a Mario Cattaneo, che già negli anni 80 aveva lavorato su Goldoni Alessandro Manzoni, Illuminismo e diritto penale, suggestioni penalistiche in testi letterari, e proprio con Cattaneo si addottora, diciamo, Arianna Sansone, che è anche appunto l'autrice del primo volume dedicato a diritto e letteratura, Giuffre 2001, che dà un panorama di quella che tradizionalmente chiamiamo la prima e la seconda fase di diritto e letteratura, che immaginiamo molto spesso come una trasposizione in Italia di movimenti americani, e scopriamo che invece più o meno negli stessi anni, nei primi decenni del Novecento, oltre che negli Stati Uniti, anche in Europa e anche in Italia si sviluppa un interesse per questo movimento. Poi l'interesse si è manifestato soprattutto, lo sottolineo, tra gli studiosi di storia del diritto medievale e contemporaneo. Ho già citato l'esperienza trentina, alla quale vorrei aggiungere l'esperienza a Roma Tor Vergata, dove proprio l'anno successivo, 2007-2008, nasce il primo corso di Law and Humanities. Poi progressivamente l'interesse per diritto e letteratura esce un po' dall'ambito dei filosofi del diritto e degli storici del diritto, dove peraltro, voglio dire, permane, ma si estende ad altre discipline, primi fra tutti gli studiosi di diritto privato comparato. Nel 2006 Barbara Pozzo ha organizzato un convegno presso l'Università dell'Insubria, con ospiti sia europei che statunitensi. Poi dal 2008 al 2009 i corsi si sono moltiplicati presso la laurea magistrale in giurisprudenza dell'Università del Sannio, con il settore scientifico diritto privato comparato, poi Urbino, torniamo nel settore della filosofia del diritto, Torino 2010-2011, nella magistrale in giurisprudenza sempre con diritto privato comparato, a Catanzaro nel 2012-2013 col settore filosofia del diritto, nel 2015-2016 l'Università del Molise, poi ancora l'Università Federico II, Palermo. Quindi veramente diciamo l'interesse per questo ambito di studi è andato diciamo estendendosi sia come aree disciplinari sia come sedi universitarie. E c'è da poco giunta, voglio dire, la notizia che prossimamente partiranno ben 2 summer school in diritto e letteratura, una a Nizza, organizzata però in co-partnership con l'Università di Torino, il DIREL, altro centro affiliato diciamo alla ISLL, e un'altra a Venezia. Per non dire poi dei seminari più specialistici. Io vorrei così terminare sottolineando quanto importante questo filone possa essere nella formazione del giurista, soprattutto diciamo dal punto di vista metodologico. E vorrei sottolineare questo aspetto citando, diciamo, questa volta in lingua originale, Martha Nussbaum, un suo bel libro, piccolo ma di grossa sostanza, come si suol dire, non per profitto, nella quale Martha Nussbaum sottolinea l'importanza degli studi umanistici nella formazione del cittadino, in particolare nella formazione del giurista, perché questo metodo è in grado di sviluppare quella che lei chiama narrative imagination, vale a dire the ability to think what it may be like to be in the shoes of a person different from oneself, to be an intelligent reader of that person's stories and to understand the emotion and wishes and desires that someone so placed may have. The cultivation of sympathy has been a key part of the best modern ideas of democratic education in both Western and non-Western nations. Quindi non mi resta che terminare con un ringraziamento veramente sentito all'Università di Trento che ci ospita, in particolare ai colleghi appunto Manzin e Puppo che all'interno diciamo di questa tradizione ormai consolidata di studi sulla retorica hanno voluto ospitare questo 7° convegno della Società Italiana di Diritto e Letteratura, e anch'io auguro a tutti buon lavoro e buona permanenza in questi 2 giorni a Trento.
So, good afternoon, everybody. I am pleased to be here in this conference, thanks to my colleagues Carla Faralli and Maurizio Manzin and Federico Puppo, as a member of the scientific committee. And I'm extremely honored to have the chance to add my own welcome address on behalf of our School of Law. My distinguished colleagues and friends, Professor Manzin and Professor Puppo, invited me to tell you something about our experience with the teaching of law and literature in this faculty. When I'm asked them in what language I was supposed to give my speech, their response was Italian, because the majority of our guests are Italians, but some preliminary words in English will be appreciated. So in obedience to the principle of majority rule, I'm going to start speaking Italian, although I'm trying not to disregard the rights of the minority of non-Italian speaking persons. As you may know, I was the dean of this faculty some 13 years ago, when law and literature was first inserted, just as Carla Faralli said, inserted in our curricular planning and began to be regularly taught. I have taught law and literature for a couple of years as an advanced course of history of modern legal thought. Then, for several years, it was the late Alessandro Fontana, emeritus at the École Normale Supérieure in Lyon, who taught law and literature, giving our students some precious anticipations of his studies on Beccaria and dei delitti e delle pene, of which Professor Fontana was preparing a new French edition with a commentary. Finally, when Professor Fontana retired, I asked Claudia Di Fonzo, a former student of mine at the doctoral school of the Istituto di Studi Umanistici in Florence, to join us to teach law and literature. She has strongly contributed during the last 5 years to give law and literature an important role for cultural characterization of our faculty. Now in Italian. Poco dopo l'avvio dei corsi di diritto e letteratura, come ricordava poc'anzi la collega Carla Faralli, abbiamo avvertito il bisogno di una riflessione sul senso di questa strana coppia, diritto e letteratura, nell'ambito dell'educazione giuridica e della storia del pensiero giuridico, antico, medievale e moderno. Quando dico strana coppia, tra virgolette, penso naturalmente al titolo di un noto saggio di Eric Friedman, Un couple étrange, apparso nel 2002 in una miscellanea dedicata a droit e letteratura. Friedman scriveva che la letteratura è lo spazio in cui si inserisce e si integra il diritto. La letteratura è lo spazio in cui si inserisce e si integra il diritto, o meglio, la narrazione del diritto, o meglio ancora, la narrazione di un dato diritto, diritti civili, diritti di laicità, diritti religiosi, diritti relativi ai contratti, alla proprietà, al matrimonio, eccetera. E portava ad esempio la tragedia greca, Shakespeare, i romanzi di Dostoevsky, Kafka, Camus. De textes littéraires qui touchent le droit, qui sont touchés par le droit, mais qui ne sont pas créateurs du droit. quack, puntini. Noi abbiamo preso le mosse dal quack, dal benché di Friedman, dal suo avvertimento dubbioso circa la possibile forza creativa di diritto insita nei testi letterari. Attorno a questa domanda è nato nel 2005, preparato nel 2004, pubblicato nel 2005, come Carla ricordava, quindi più di 10 anni fa, uno dei primi numeri monografici di Laboratoire Italien, la rivista edita dall'École Normale Supérieure di Lione, che nasce da un forte gruppo di italianisti vocati allo studio della letteratura tardo-medievale e rinascimentale italiana, con cui collaboriamo da, credo, almeno 25 anni. Il numero era tra gli altri curato da Giuliano Marchetto, un mio allievo che insegna qui da noi storia del diritto internazionale. Dunque, la letteratura come fonte di diritto? Se è facilmente comprensibile che il fenomeno giuridico possa riflettersi con chiarezza nello specchio della letteratura, law in literature, ed è in qualche misura accettabile che il diritto stesso appartenga alle forme letterarie, law as literature. Uno dei nostri grandi giuristi, Salvatore Satta, nella prefazione ad un suo manuale di diritto processuale civile, diceva che quando si sarebbero fatti i conti alla fine del secolo appena passato, si sarebbe forse scoperto che la migliore letteratura tout court in Italia sarebbe stata quella dei giuristi. Il diritto come letteratura. Ed è in qualche misura, se è in qualche misura accettabile che il diritto stesso appartenga alle forme letterarie, appunto law as literature, non sembra altrettanto comprensibile e accettabile l'idea che il diritto possa essere lo spazio in cui si integra la letteratura. Il diritto come spazio in cui si inserisce e si integra la letteratura. Insomma, lo specchio di un'esperienza letteraria che pretende ad una forza normativa. Literature in law, se non proprio literature as law. Dunque, non tanto il diritto nella letteratura, quanto la letteratura nel diritto, vale a dire l'uso che i giuristi fanno della letteratura come fonte autorevole, persino nell'età intermedia come fonte autoritativa in senso forte, come base e fondamento della riflessione e della creazione di dottrina. Appunto, il maturo medioevo giuridico che giunge fino a redigere glosse giuridiche attorno a testi letterari di comprovata autorità morale. Questa è l'ipotesi attorno alla quale abbiamo lavorato in questi anni e attorno alla quale continuiamo a lavorare, dedicando attenzione soprattutto, anche se non esclusivamente, alla relazione tra le opere letterarie del Medioevo e la tradizione del diritto comune, a cominciare dal caratteristico fenomeno del dantismo giuridico. Con Maurizio Manzin abbiamo cominciato molti anni fa, 25 forse anni fa, quando io ero un giovane professore e lui era un giovane ricercatore. Ora io sono il decano della facoltà e lui è un maturo professore. Abbiamo cominciato a discutere attorno alla relazione tra diritto e letteratura nei giuristi umanisti, attorno al petrarchismo giuridico, ma esiste un fenomeno che è il dantismo giuridico, di cui si occupa qui da noi Claudia Di Fonzo e di cui io stesso ho cercato di dare dimostrazione nel commentario della nuova edizione della Monarchia di Dante per i Meridiani Mondadori, che è appena apparsa. Devo dire che però tutto il gruppo degli storici a Trento, con Claudia Di Fonzo e Giuliano Marchetto già ricordati, i colleghi Cecilia Natalini, Lucia Bianchin, Cristian Zenderi, Beatrice Primerano, fino ai più giovani tra i nostri studiosi, che sono qui, Andrew Cecchinato, Giovanni Zagnol, i nostri dottorandi, il gruppo ha lavorato in questa direzione, soprattutto negli ultimi anni, grazie anche alla partecipazione fruttuosa ad un progetto di interesse nazionale, quello che in Italia siamo soliti chiamare con l'acronimo PRIN, che per tutto il mondo è misterioso e forse anche per qualcuno in Italia, grazie appunto ad un progetto di interesse nazionale che aveva per fine una nuova enciclopedia dantesca digitalizzata e che si è appena concluso con la produzione di alcuni volumi e con un grande convegno a Pisa. Un altro convegno, centrato appunto sulla relazione di Dante col diritto e con le correnti giusdottrinali del suo tempo da una parte e dall'altra sull'influenza delle opere di Dante sul pensiero giuridico medievale e moderno, è in preparazione qui a Trento per la fine del prossimo autunno. Tutto ciò naturalmente sarebbe insufficiente se non ricordassi che attorno al problema della relazione dialettica tra letteratura e diritto, come dimostra anche questo intervento sollecitato dagli amici filosofi, si è sviluppato negli anni in questa facoltà un interesse che coinvolge altri studiosi e altre aree scientifico-disciplinari, dalla romanistica al diritto pubblico, dal diritto privato al diritto processuale civile, al diritto del lavoro, eccetera. In questa prospettiva, concludo, spero che questi lavori possano essere l'occasione per un ulteriore scambio di idee e di esperienze all'insegna di un sentimento comune, che un nostro grande e non dimenticato interprete, Francesco Ruffini, esprimeva più di un secolo fa in margine alla sua opera più nota, scrivendo che nulla più della letteratura può darci un'idea esatta delle vere condizioni della libertà in un tempo dato e in un dato ambiente, laddove la nuda lettera della legge è documento monco e malcelto. So I hope that this exchange of ideas and experiences from different points of view will provide valuable insight that can help to guide future discussion of our main issues. Thank you for your attention, grazie a tutti e buon lavoro.
Con molto piacere concludo questo momento di saluti e anche di introduzione ai nostri lavori. È un momento ufficiale, quello dell'apertura di un convegno, però è anche, vorrei che fosse anche un momento amichevole, un momento di amicizia. Molti volti che vedo qui di fronte a me mi sono familiari, sono volti di amici, e spero che ci sarà modo sia nel corso della parte accademica, scientifica del nostro incontro che in quella conviviale stasera, di poter creare un'amalgama, perché questo è soprattutto lo scopo tanto delle giornate tridentine quanto del convegno della Società Italiana di Diritto e Letteratura. Ufficialmente, a titolo mio personale, ma soprattutto come presidente del Cermeg, del Centro di Ricerche sulla Metodologia Giuridica, do a tutti loro il benvenuto. Sono molto lieto di avere la possibilità di ospitare come giornate tridentine di retorica il 7° convegno della Società Italiana di Diritto e Letteratura. Sono molto grato in particolar modo a Maria Paola Mittica del nostro comitato scientifico, che ha dato un grosso aiuto all'organizzazione di questo convegno, dietro alle quinte. Lei in questo momento non è qui, ma molto dobbiamo anche al suo aiuto. Tramite lei ringrazio il suo Dipartimento che ha contribuito al finanziamento di questa iniziativa e naturalmente il preside, richiamato in questo momento dalla biglietteria dell'aeroporto, per il supporto che la facoltà ci ha dato, direi molto convintamente. Questo convegno ormai annuale, sono 16 anni che viene fatto, rientra pienamente, strategicamente nell'attività di ricerca di questa facoltà. E anche un grazie molto sentito all'amica Carla Faralli per essere qui nella sua duplice veste di presidente sia della Società dei Filosofi del Diritto che di quella degli studiosi di diritto e letteratura.
Più presidente di quella di, di diritto e letteratura, perché essendoci trasformati in network siamo coordinatrici, io e Paola sullo stesso piano.
Ah, d'accordo.
Scusate, ma
è talmente gradevole questo consolato.
Esattamente.
And some word in English now. I'm particularly happy to welcome all our guests from abroad. And on behalf of the Research Center on Legal Methodology, I thank them for coming here and staying with us. As you know, we have 2 official working languages, and for that we have provided 2 parallel sessions of working groups, some in Italian and some others in English, and also 2 keynote lectures. The first one, which is going to start in English, and the one of tomorrow in Italian. Thank you to our prominent lecturers. I can't ensure them a good weather, but I can ensure that a good time. So I wish you to enjoy the conference, and dichiaro ufficialmente aperta la 16ª edizione delle giornate tridentine di retorica e la 7ª edizione del convegno della Società Italiana di Diritto e Letteratura. I declare officially open the conference. Thank you.
So now it's up to me, and I'm very glad to thank you very much indeed, Mr. Dean, to introduce you Professor Jens Kjeldsen, who is Professor of Rhetoric and Visual Communication at the Department of Information Science and Media Studies, the University of Bergen in Norway, where he has worked as Deputy Head of Department and Board Member for the Faculty of Social Sciences. He also worked as a Professor of Rhetoric at the Södertörn University in Stockholm, Sweden, and he is the initiator and president of the organization called Rhetoric Society of Europe. His main interest is visual rhetoric and argumentation, political speech making and speech writing, rhetoric in public communication, and the teaching of writing. He also works on rhetorical theory, especially in relation to media and to the changing of rhetorical situations in a fragmented, complex, and mediated world. He's presently working on a series of texts on visual rhetoric and argumentation, and is the project leader of the research project called Presentation Practices that studies the rhetoric and pedagogy in teaching using digital presentation tools. For us, it's a great honor and a pleasure to have here Jens, and he's going to have a lecture on persuasive imaginary, visuality in rhetoric and argumentation. I know that his talk is going about 45 minutes, and so Jens, thanks again. The floor is up to you.
Thank you so much. Trento, what a beautiful city, what a wonderful country, and what an amazing football team you all have here. I am humbled and honored to be here, really. It's a big pleasure for me to be invited to Trento. I would especially like to give my thanks to the programming committee and to Maurizio Manzin, to Federico Puppo, and Serena Tomasi. I meet these 3 individuals often on conferences around the world, and I can assure you they make their country proud. You should be proud of them. They do a really good job around the world, both in their talks and, as we all know, being very nice persons. I am a member of the minority. I do not speak Italian, so I will do my talk today in English. I am Danish, but I live in Norway, and I will warn you right out from the start, I don't know much about law, but I have not been invited here to talk about the law. I have been invited here to talk about images and pictures and visual rhetoric and argumentation, and that I do know something about. And I think it speaks to the intellectual curiosity and openness of the programming committee, and especially Federico, that they invite me here from a different field than you. So let me start. What is the power of an image? Where does it reside? How do we research the power of images? And today, I will try to explore this by first explaining what I consider the main rhetorical power of images, and the 4 rhetorical potentials that I think constitute this power. Then I will examine a specific news photograph and the rhetorical situation it is embedded in. The photograph that I will explore in more detail later is this one. The image of the dead Syrian toddler Aylan Kurdi washed up on a beach near Bodrum, Turkey on September the 2nd, 2015. The Turkish photographer Nilüfer Demir took this picture. It caused international outrage and it was immediately perceived as an iconic photograph. I will get back to this photograph later. At this moment, it's enough to ask, what is the rhetorical power of a photograph like this? How should we research such photographs? When encountering images like the one you see here, nobody, I suspect, would comment it with words such as, look at that important information, or even, this is an extraordinary message. It seems inappropriate, incorrect somehow, to consider what you see here as information or as a message. Still, much of research approached visual communication as transmission of information. The study of visual rhetoric, for instance, is often based on linguistic, structural, and semiotic theories of meaning. However, pictures, I suggest, offer something more, something that is not decoded as meaning or semiotic content, something that works rhetorically by creating resonance in the audience. Practitioner and media researcher Tony Schwartz called this the principle of resonance. Creating resonance characterizes media that are not trying to put anything into the audience, but rather to release something that is already in the audience. Media that works in this way, Schwartz calls perceived media. Moving images, pictures, and sounds are examples of this. Generally, these media do not require special skills in the audience to produce their effect. They're instantly understood, and thus perceived media is something that we automatically interact with. It evokes memory, emotions, and thoughts within us actively without we actually having to remember. In contrast to this, received media, like most written texts, are characterized by requiring skills, learning, time in order to be understood. Received media is something that people react to. It attempts to make the audience learn and remember new information. So this is different. Instead of taking something out, it tries to put something into the audience. Schwartz's account of how resonance and perceived media works rhetorically is very similar to the way the ancient rhetoricians think about the power of delivery. Here as well, the aim is to evoke already existing emotions and recollections in the audience. In De Oratore, for instance, Cicero compares delivery, actio, with the sounds of the strings of the lyra, since both may evoke emotional resonance in the audience. The ancients also put great emphasis on energia and evidentia, the detailed and vivid presentation, making events come alive before the eyes of the audience. Now, this power to create evidentia and resonance is probably the most rhetorical characteristic in representational images. Rhetorically, such vivid images works differently from linguistic and semiotic creation of meaning, operating through arbitrary codes and conventions. Now, for instance, with an example, I might inform you in words or explain to you that the British newspaper The Sun prints pictures of topless women on page 3. But that do not really make an impact on you, do it? The impact will be very different if I actually show you a topless woman. Or you may read in the newspaper that 4 siblings, small siblings in Gaza, were killed in an airstrike. But actually, seeing the dead children lying in the morgue, still in their pajamas, makes an impact that is beyond words and semiotic analysis. In general, I suggest theories of visual communication can be divided into 2 main strands: a phenomenologically influenced tradition regarding pictures as a sort of mediated evidentia, and a semiotically influenced view regarding pictures as codified language systems. And I argue that the rhetorical power of representational pictures depends on both. The rhetorical power of pictures lie in their semiotic capability to communicate simultaneously through iconic, conventional, and sometimes indexical codes. Thus, the full rhetorical potential of pictures is exercised when their discursive ability to create utterances, propositions, and arguments is united with their aesthetic materiality and their sensual immediacy. Pictures have an ability to do this because they afford 4 interaction rhetorical potentials. These are the potentials for creating presence, realism, immediacy, and condensation. Let's begin with the power to create presence, which I've already touched upon. Since antiquity, rhetoricians and orators have attempted to create evidentia by presenting events to the audience as though they see them with their own eyes. In the new Rhetoric, Perelman and Albrecht-Stidecke describes presence as something that acts directly on our sensibility. It makes present what is actually absent because the speaker considers it important to his arguments. Presence makes something more salient, important, and memorable, and Perelman and Albrecht-Stidecke considers it to be of paramount importance to the technique of argumentation. They write in the rhetorical tradition of making things vivid and present through words. Because words are received media, they must be decoded and understood before they can exert their power of presence. However, perceived media, pictures, for instance, actually presents things visually so that the audience can see them with their own eyes. In doing so, they do not as much communicate as they present a visual event, to use a concept from visual culture scholar Nicholas Merzoff. In contrast to the abstract representing of words verbally, he argues that the presenting of visual events has sensual immediacy. You can almost feel it. The sensual part of this concept refers to the aesthetic, material quality of pictures that creates vividness and presence. The power and persuasiveness of bringing events vividly in front of the audience is that such presence and closeness is linked to urgency and importance. Because the closer something is to us, the more salient, important, and urgent it seems. The ability to create presence supports and is supported by the second quality of pictures, the potential for realism. Now, I know very well that realism is a contested concept in aesthetic theory. However, I'm simply referring to the ability of pictures to present something as though it is reality itself. Like the quality of presence, reality is built upon a semiotic, iconic coding based on similarity. Now, I'm not suggesting a simple copy theory of representation, but on the other hand, there's no denying that people actually experience that photograph resemble things that we recognize from real life. They give an impression of reality itself. The American researcher of photography, Kara Finnegan, has labeled this the naturalistic enthymeme. The naturalistic enthymeme. And she says, we assume that photographic images are true or real until we are given a reason to doubt them. The rhetorical power of the reality effect in non-photographic pictures has, for instance, been documented by art historian David Friedberg's monumental work, The Power of Images. He shows how realism and resemblance through history has been essential for the power of images, because they make the representation appear as a presentation, involving the viewer in a direct, empathic relation with the depicted. There are many different visual conventions for obtaining this, the use of perspective, for instance. However, in the present context, it should be understood as the ability of a pictorial representation to appear as a pure representation. The third quality of pictures is their potential for immediacy in perception. While listening or reading requires a temporal reception, pictures may be received and understood in a brief instant. The notion of immediacy of visual arts was probably first theoretically developed by the Enlightenment writer Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, who distinguishes between the spatial arts of painting and sculpture on the one hand, and the temporal and successive art of literature on the other hand. In the same way, the 20th century phenomenologist Hans Jonas has pointed out that simultaneousness is the unique trait of visual perception. He says, sight is par excellence the sense of the simultaneous or coordinated, and thereby of the extensive. A view comprehends many things juxtaposed as coexistent parts of one field of vision. It does so in an instant. As a flash in one glance, in opening of the eyes, discloses a world of co-present qualities spread out in space. Because think about it. In order to hear something, you have to wait for the sounds being made. You're forced to listen during the time they're passing. In order to see, all you have to do is open your eyes, and you will have received what is there right in front of you. Using Swart's concepts, we can say that visual art as received media, and when we do that, we do not overlook the evoking power of sensual immediacy of visuality in perceived media. The potential for immediacy is closely connected to the fourth quality, symbolic condensation. This refers to the condensing of many different thoughts into one, so that a single effect and meaning in a picture is grabbed in one single instant. Now, this does not mean that the communicated relations are less complex. On the contrary, we may say that their complexity is not limited by the linear structure and discursivity of verbal communication. Langer, for instance, notices that an idea that contains too many minute yet closely related relations cannot be projected into discursive form. It is too subtle for speech. However, we can do this with the non-discursive symbolism we find in pictures, because the primary function of the non-discursive is the conceptualizing the flux of sensations and giving us concrete things in place of kaleidoscopic colors or noises. But the rhetorical point of symbolic condensation is not primarily that it connects with immediacy, but its possibility of cueing and evoking condensed thoughts and emotions. Think about it as a small bud that blossoms into a huge flower. Imagery may lead to the same outfolding of emotions and longer trains of thoughts. This is why we can do argumentation with images, which I will illustrate in a short second. In this way, condensation can be both emotional, images can evoke emotions in you, and it can be rational, images can evoke arguments. Emotional condensation means that an image or something in an image can release an extensive emotional response. The persuasive power of an iconic representation consists of its ability to recreate visual cues which in the real world is connected to specific emotional responses. Think about yourself. If you see a small child in real life, your parental instincts may be evolved. It does with me, at least now that I have children of my own. A picture of the same works in much the same way. But emotions are not only released by what you actually see, also what it shows or how it shows, such as the point of view in a picture. A high-angle shot, for instance, will give us a sense of power and control, while a low-angle shot is more similar to situations when we are confronted with someone else that are powerful. Because we are positioned as viewers in a way that is analog to positions we recognize from the physical world and our social life, we are invited to react in similar ways. That is probably why you reacted to the image of Alan Kurdi that I showed you just a few minutes ago. Whereas the emotional condensation is mostly connected to the phenomenological view of imagery as an event, the aspect of symbolic condensation as a way of evoking argument and reasoning is more connected to the view of imagery as codified language system. Rational symbolic condensation is a basis for visual argumentation. It's similar to Freud's concept of condensation into dream words, if some of you know this, because it signifies many ideas condensed into one. And because pictures have the same ability to release such condensation, they also have an ability to present arguments. Rational condensation in pictures, then, is the visual counterpart of verbal argumentation. However, the spectator needs certain direction to be able to reconstruct the arguments, some cognitive schemes to make use of. Sometimes they're found in the context themselves, and other times, especially in advertising, they're found in visual tropes and figures. So, to sum up thus far, pictorial rhetoric must be examined both as aesthetic phenomenological events and as semiotic discursive messages. We must acknowledge their ability for both operating as a language system and using conventional codes, and as mediated evidentia, presenting direct aesthetic and sensual immediacy. We must also bear in mind the four rhetorical potentials of pictures: presence, realism, immediacy, and some symbolic condensation. So let's try now to examine the rhetoric of the Alan Kurdi image with the four rhetorical potentials. We'll use the reproduction of the image that you see here, the way it was printed on the Scottish newspaper, The National. Across the headline in the middle, the title says, "The Reality, Why Europe Must Act Now." The bottom of the front page, which you see here, is a quote of the CEO of Save the Children, Justin Forsyth, saying, and I quote him, "This tragic image of a little boy who lost his life fleeing Syria is a shocking and a reminder of the dangers children and families are taking in the search of a better life. The child's plight should concentrate minds and force the EU to come together and agree to plan and tackle the refugee crisis." And this is exactly what the image does. It concentrates the mind and it creates presence. I mean, I could have talked to you about this image, but there's nothing like seeing it for yourself, because it does, like the ancient rhetoricians say, bring the event right in front of your eyes. Because even though this is a picture, the dead body of a child is there, right in front of your eyes, urging you to take action. And as a photograph, it's also a document to reality itself. Now, some of you might say, well, Jens, you know, we can manipulate images, photographs, so why should we trust an image? But then ask yourself, when was the last time you opened the newspaper and you thought, oh, I think this picture, this photograph has been manipulated? Normally we would not do that. So even we can change images, we normally assume that they express the truth. The image also offers immediacy because we understand it immediately. Now imagine again that I should talk to you about this image, explain what we see, the details, for instance, the color of his shirt, the trousers, the little gap he has between the red shirt and the blue trousers. Explaining all these details would take minutes, perhaps hours, but just seeing the image, it works immediately. And think about condensation. Now, even though I claim that this is just an image showing something, it also has decoded meaning. It condenses all the emotions that I've talked about and meanings. What, for instance, does the policeman represent? Is he just a policeman? Or is he perhaps us onlookers, we looking perhaps passively at the disaster of the third world? And perhaps the dead child, Aylan Kurdi, is not just Aylan Kurdi, because as a synecdoche, he represents other suffering children, or even all the victims of the refugee crisis. And what about the way that the dead Aylan Kurdi lies on the beach? Well, look at him. What do you think about when you see the boy on the beach? What does it evoke in you? I would suggest that two simultaneous, contradictory emotions are evoked in you. Because what does he look like? Well, first of all, as many people have said, he looks like a sleeping child. A sleeping child is one of the most innocent things you can imagine. But he looks like something different as well. He looks like flotsam, useless wreckage, flushed up on the beach, old wood, something that has no value, been dumped in the ocean, been flushed up on the sea. And when you combine those two images in your head or on the screen, the most innocent thing you can imagine and useless wreckage, those two emotions are fusioned. This is perhaps why it's no coincidence that many observers talked about this as humanity washed ashore. Now, the notion of the sleeping innocence is not just something that I invent. If you look at the way people talked about this image and presented it online, you often saw this. For instance, here in a Twitter message of Kurdi as a sleeping baby. Now, this is just a very short analysis about some of the rhetorical powers in this image. However, as already indicated, we will not understand the power of this image if we look just at the photographs. We have to look at the whole situation as well. So I'll try to give an account of the response of the Kurdi images in the United Kingdom as a specific example, an example of how the images were in fact used and understood as an argument. And I will further support this by demonstrating how the critics assumed that the images put forward arguments and then they attempted to argue back. So if some of you think, well, you can't really argue with images, I will try to argue the opposite now. I do this because the persuasive power of an image is not in the image alone. If we only understand the power of photographs, we can only understand it if we understand it in relation to the context and the audience. And the context, of course, as you know, was the European migrant crisis of the spring 2015. During this crisis, a vast influx of refugees and immigrants became a concern for both citizens and politicians of Europe. And I think it was a special concern in Italy, where you had boats running around the Middle Sea looking for immigrants. But most people did not only worry about the immigrants. Many people, and perhaps especially politicians, worried about how they could handle this in their own countries. Countries struggled to cope with the influx, and the EU was divided over how best to resettle all these people. On August the 28th, for instance, before the Aylan Kurdi images, the Daily Mail used capital letters on the front page to express concern about immigration. This is the 28th of August. The pictures of Aylan Kurdi came in on the 2nd of September. Migrants. How many more can we take? The paper reported that damning figures revealed net migration has surged to 330,000. They reported about these, and I quote, devastating statistics. And they wrote, come as thousands of migrants yesterday flooded across, notice that wording, the migrants flood across, that's not an objective way of expressing it, flooded across the Hungarian border into Central Europe. Many will now head to Calais to join those trying to sneak into Britain. This negative attitude to the crisis, however, changed only 6 days later when the Daily Mail printed a photograph of the Turkish policeman carrying the dead body of the drowned 3-year-old off the beach. But now the heading said, tiny victim of a human catastrophe. Now, apparently, the image changed the newspaper's position. So is this the power of an image? I think we should be slightly careful to take this as an indication of rhetorical power of one image. Because there were several images of the Syrian toddler circulating. The most published picture of Aylan Kurdi is the one you see here, showing a Turkish policeman carrying the body of Aylan Kurdi off the beach, moving to the right in the picture frame. Another showed the officer standing in the left side with his back to the viewer while looking down at the dead Aylan Kurdi. Other pictures were close-ups of Kurdi lying face down on the beach with water ripples flowing toward his face. These pictures were both taken with the face of the boy turned away to the viewer, like the one you see here, and they were also taken with the face turned towards the viewer, like the one you see here. So we know there are several images of Aylan Kurdi, and we know from our analysis previously that they have rhetorical power. This rhetorical power seemed to be confirmed by a study done by the European Journalism Observatory, who argued that Western European newspapers became, and I quote, significantly more sympathetic towards migrants and refugees immediately after the publishing of the pictures. So they're basically saying the pictures changed the way we looked at the crisis. According to this study, positive articles about the domestic impact of migrants, and you can think about your own newspapers in Italy, the domestic impact of migrants and domestic policies towards them increased in Western European newspapers. We changed our views immediately after the publication. The increase, however, was short-lived, especially in the UK and Portugal, but also here in Italy. So first we were all very positive, but then not for so long. Especially in the UK, the numbers of domestic positive articles increased from 0, this is just the UK, from 0 to 7 in 2 days. It was 0 in 2 days before the pictures, and it was 7 in the days after. However, the number has decreased to only 2 positive stories 1 week later. So everybody gets behind the pictures, and 1 week passes, and not so much. One explanation of both the increase and the decrease of the positive reception is that the images of Kurdi was not viewed as objective. They were used as rhetoric. They were being viewed as deliberation. They were being used and viewed as used to argue, and they were argued against. And this was evident from many of the newspaper front pages on September the 3rd, 2015. I'll show these pictures. In United Kingdom, for instance, the images dominated the front pages, like here in the Daily Mirror. They showed the police officer carrying the boy away from the shore, and the war letter headline exclaimed, "Unbearable." And the front page of the text said, "A 3-year-old boy watched upon a holiday beach in Turkey, the heartbreaking human face of a tragedy the world can no longer ignore." The paper laid the blame at Britain's door, saying the harrowing image should shame leaders, including David Cameron, who refused to accept more refugees. The tabloid The Sun showed the photographs beside a photograph of a little baby born in a Hungarian refugee station. The picture of the policeman was labeled, "Died on a Turkish beach yesterday." And there was a direct call above the picture to the Prime Minister, "Mr. Cameron, summer is over, now deal with the biggest crisis facing Europe since World War II. So the image leads to direct encouragement. The free paper Metro used the same picture stating, "Europe could not save him." Now, the whole of Europe has responsibility. The Guardian saw the photograph as a picture of reality. And remember what I said about reality just a few moments ago. The shocking, cruel reality of Europe's refugee crisis. The paper tells you you are watching reality. The Independent covered most of the front page with the image of Aylan Kurdi lying face down in the sand with a police officer standing at the right of the image. The title and the text below the image says, "Somebody's child." The tide of desperate humanity seeking safety in Europe is rising. Yesterday's victims include this Syrian boy drowned in his family's attempt to reach Greece from Turkey. The EU is deadlocked. Our Prime Minister, the British Prime Minister, is in denial. A vast human catastrophe is unfolding. Do we really believe this is not our problem? Now, you may think that the images of Aylan Kurdi are not arguments, and you might be right. The images are not arguments in themselves, but they are clearly used deliberatively to put forward political advice and recommendations. The most common and most general advice is, do something about the refugee crisis. Considered as a standpoint in a deliberative situation, the images are used as support for an argument that is something like this. Do something about the refugee crisis. The situation is untenable. Even young children like Aylan Kurdi are dying. And this is a common topos, not just from this situation. It's a common topos, a common line of reasoning in news photographs about conflict, war, and catastrophe. The documentary nature of photojournalism itself invites such reasoning. When journalistic images document intolerable injustice, suffering, or pain, they inherently carry forward a call to action. Now, as I told you, I don't know much about law, but I would assume that the same would go for drawing images with words in a court of law, or even showing imagery in a court of law. They function as visually manifest premises, document the reason why we must take action. Why do we must take action? Here's the reason. Many photographs from the Vietnam War, for instance, can be seen as claims and arguments encouraging the United States to withdraw from Vietnam. And I bet a few of you, when I say the Vietnam War, are already imagining pictures in your head. Perhaps you're seeing this picture. One of the most notable examples is Eddie Adams' photograph of the execution, the summary execution. He just goes up to him like this, bang, and he kills him. It takes 2 seconds. Execution of a Viet Cong prisoner on a Saigon street. Another example is Nick Ut's photograph of a young girl running towards the camera, screaming from the napalm burns on her back and her arm. Such photographs confront US citizens, or Americans in general, with the immorality of their actions. It accuses the Americans and inevitably invites moral reasoning, argumentation, and hence action. In pragmadialectical terms, this can be defined as an argument based on a symptomatic relation. It is true of X because Z is true of X and Z is symptomatic of Y. In the case of Aylan Kurdi photographs, the symptomatic relation is argumentation by example, in which the images can be expressed in this way. The migration crisis is unbearable and must be acted upon. The death of innocent children is unbearable. The death of the 3-year-old Aylan Kurdi is an instance of this. As we have already seen, the argumentative dimensions of the press photographs are also revealed in reporters' comments and the editor's use of images on the front page, where they function as multimodal encouragement to action. And when I say multimodal, it's very important that these are not just the photographs. There are text around the photographs, and you can't even think about the photographs, I suggest to you, without using words and concepts. If you look at a photograph and feel compassion, you have the notion of compassion in your head. So you cannot divide the verbal from the visual. So as we've already seen, the argumentative dimensions of the press photographs are also revealed in the words. One certain sign or that a claim or an argument is being present is the emergence of refutation. So when people start to arguing back, you know that argumentation has been made. If there had not been an understanding that arguments were being put forward, then there would be no reason at all to refute such argumentation. So understanding the pictures or the multimodal syntagms as arguments becomes evident in the many articles and comments refuting the call for compassion and action that I have just illustrated with the front pages. Take this newspaper, The Telegraph, for instance. On the day Aylan Kurdi dominated the front pages, The Telegraph headed its editorial. This is the policy of the newspaper, with the title, "The refugees' welcome fad will do more harm than good." So basically, being very positive and sensitive about the refugees will do more harm than good. The subheading claimed, "The Prime Minister's policy of helping refugees stay put is rational and a moral position, but difficult to sustain when you're accused of heartlessness." This argument was directly connected to the images of Aylan Kurdi. The editorial sees the images not only as news photograph documenting evidence, but also as rhetorical vehicles arguing for a change in policy. In the Daily Mail, one day later, the columnist John Littleton headed his articles with the words, "This child's death was tragic, but it's not our fault." He acknowledged that the images were heart-wrenching, but argued strongly against the interpretation and the rhetorical use of these images. Let me just read what he says. "Objective reporting, especially on the broadcast media, has been thrown out the window to be replaced by New Age emoting and political posturing on behalf of the let 'em all in and we all to blame brigade. It has proved once again Stalin's cynical maxim that while one death is always a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistics. Which brings us back to the child's corpse on the beach in Turkey. I repeat, it is awful, heartbreaking, but it is not our fault. It is not our responsibility, however compassionate we might feel. So while many people reject, and critics reject the Kurdi images, they reject them as propaganda, emotional blackmail, but they still think about them as argumentation, as from example. And when you look at all these people arguing back, they refute, or they try to refute the images, and they do four things. First of all, they reject the veracity of the pictures. Some said, oh, the images are fake. Some people reject that the migrants are really refugees. They're not really refugees, they are well off. Some accept the tragedy of the situation, but they refute responsibility. And some accept the tragedy of the situation and take some responsibility, but they argue that the right action is not to accept great numbers of migrants and refugees. On September 10th, for instance, the Express Online published a widely circulated image of a group of young, smiling Syrian men making victory signs with their fingers. And of course, the argument is, well, do these people look like immigrants? They are happy, they have cell phones. Of course, they are not victims, was the argument. Let me close now with one more example of the power of the images. When images are used and reused and appropriated, it not only shows that the images are powerful, it also quotes the argument. Take this picture here, for instance, with Aylan Kurdi on the EU floor. This is one appropriation found on Twitter depicting him lying on the EU conference table, surrounded by people sitting with their backs to him. Another depicted Aylan in the middle of another parliament, followed by the text, "Can you see it now?" And take this Facebook posting. Exactly who is being addressed here? Well, there's no power that the image uses, there's no doubt that the image uses the power of the original image, but it's not completely clear who it's addressing. However, it seems that they, or we, are accused of caring more about animals than about children from the Middle East. All these online posts illustrate that pictures certainly have rhetorical power. They illustrate that pictures work rhetorically both as visual events, creating emotional resonance, and as semiotic utterances, working as a language that produces symbols to be decoded and putting arguments forward. However, at the time, the online post also illustrates that the pictorial power is not unlimited. If people do not share the feelings, they will resist the emotional appeal. If they disagree, even with images, they will argue back, sometimes with other images. So let me end with these words. If we wish to understand the power of images, we should not only examine pictures, we should also examine the context and the audience. And this, I believe, is true of all kinds of rhetoric. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jens. We do have around 10 or 15 minutes for question time, please. Joseph?
Yes, thank you very much for this
Thank you.
interesting talk. What I would like to, probably you are familiar with the work of Paul van der Hoven.
Yeah.
He's a professor in the Netherlands, and he's working on rhetoric, and he's professor in law. So he is combining the things. What I would like to know from you is you use a lot of very emotional pictures. Whereas in the Netherlands, we are not so much used to use pictures or moving images in court. But especially the pictures
So, did you hear the question? Yeah. Is there a difference between very emotional pictures that I showed now and many non-emotional pictures that are being studied in the Netherlands as, and if I heard you correctly, is being used in a court of law? Is that correct?
Well, it is discussed because what you said, we assume that they are the truth.
Yeah.
Assume that they are the truth. But that is exactly what is discussed. And then it is not so much about these emotional things, but already that the court could think, well, what better could you have than a picture? Because this is what happens at this moment. And that is very much discussed, and we're not, well, there's not a final solution. Some legal theorists have their ideas about this, but it is especially this comparison between the emotional thing and, for example, reconstructing, as we also did political cartoons, for example, then you know there is a standpoint and it is funny or there is an emotion. So,
And this is a very good question. Now, I think if I say the power of pictures, most of you would think about emotions, because that is what most people think, that the power of pictures lies in the emotions, which was also the kind of pictures that I showed here. But the paradoxical thing is that the more emotional the images are, the more they redirect our attention towards them being rhetoric. So if you have, and that's why people argue back at these pictures. So on one hand, they are very strong and powerful because they're emotional, but they're mostly strong and powerful emotionally to the people that already agree. Think about Donald Trump. Donald Trump do not really argue. He just say, if you dislike Mexicans, come over here. And he can say that very strongly and powerfully, and pictures do the same. But most people would argue back, people with another opinion would argue back with these emotions. They would neglect or reject the emotion. On the other hand, non-emotional pictures can be even more powerful because we do not notice that they exert visual power, because we just assume that they show, reality. But on the other hand, the documentation, of course, is not in the image. For instance, if I drive too fast in my car in Norway, there's a camera taking a picture of me. Do you have this here? Yeah, yes. Unfortunately, and I did this in the United States as well. So I got a picture of myself in the mail, with me in my car doing a right turn where I was not allowed to it. Now that was me in the car, and I accepted the fine because it's a proof. It's a document that proves that I was there. But on the other hand, I do not do it because I can see myself in the picture. I do it because there's a system of trust that produces this picture. Now, I could say, it's not me. They manipulated the photograph. But because I would not think that a camera would be manipulated to take a photograph that is not me, or someone in the State Department of the United States would manipulate it, I trust the picture. So I see the picture and I trust it, but I trust it because there's a system of trust that lies behind it. And I think that's very important with images that are not emotional and therefore can be used to document. Was that an answer? Not really. For now, I'll talk to you later.
Valerie Thier, and then Maurizio Manzin.
Thank you for your speech, but I agree with the reference you have done to the phenomenological perspective and semiotic one. But I think I don't agree with the use of the word condensation. I think condensation, emotional and rational condensation, is like a commitment to a passive version of phenomenology, and only descriptive version of semiotics. I think the relation between image and law is something like different with reference to images and arts. And this is very different from the origin of the tradition of legal emblems in law as a source of law. So I think the idea of condensation is is yet a linguistic one and not following the iconic turn. Thank you.
Well, that's a good point. I don't think I agree, but I have to think about this. I've been looking for a word that can grasp and describe what I'm looking for, and I think when you study music or art or expressions of that kind, it's often very hard to do in words because there's something there that's a sort of a surplus value that you can't grasp with the words. I mean, the moment I start talking about the pictures, I change my semiotic system and I start talking about it in verbal words. But in lack of a better word, I still think that condensation is a good word, because it does seem that if you cannot neglect that something has to be in the expression, in the word or the image, that can cue and evoke something in the audience. So if you should not call it condensation, I'm not sure what you should call it. I mean, what kind of words would you use? And do you not agree that there's something in the image that evokes something?
Some I don't know, obviously, what could be the correct word. But I think that the reference is something about not reductionism, not positivistic Freudian anthropological reductionism.
No.
So the language of the relation between image and law are some active one, some reference to the visible, the phenomenology of the invisible, the relation between the foundation. It's not only a logic one, I think. Imagery, but imaginary in Castoriadis' way, for example, or something like that. The problem is, I think, the anthropological connection between the rational and the emotional. That is not. That I think that is not in Freudian conception of condensation.
No,
or something automatic one.
I think you may. I'm not advocating a Freudian use of condensation. I'm trying to use condensation in a different way. But we can take more questions.
Okay. Maurizio.
Well, first of all, thank you for a very interesting presentation. Briefly, two questions. The first one is, it is not so clear to me the difference between presence and realism. It seems quite overlapping between them. Yeah. And the second one is, you said that an image, it's not an argument in itself, but I think it can become part of an argument. And so my question is, can you develop this point in a more wide way, so to understand what's the exact mechanism on the basis of which an image became part of an argumentation? Okay. Thank you.
The four potentials I talk about are all overlapping, they are all more or less. All of them are more or less overlapping. So it's not that it's one or the other, and the power of pictures is not that it has one or the other, but that it may use all of them simultaneously. So realism is not necessarily that it looks real, but that it evokes a sense of reality. For instance, if you have a videotape that is sort of shaky and bad quality, that can mean realism, or that can evoke a sense of realism, because the audience would think, well, this is so badly produced that it's not produced. It's a sign of reality that you have like a handheld shaking camera. But the point of the four potentials is that they work together, they're overlapping. And the point of images not being arguments in themselves, and I think that goes for perhaps for arguments in general, is that images are something you use to make arguments with. Now, the image of Aylan Kurdi can be an argument or be used as an argument, but it can also not be an argument. So it depends on the situation and goes back to the condensation point. So we all have networks of meaning and networks of emotions. For instance, if you oh, wait a minute. Oh, I don't have the picture. If you think about the image where he's sleeping, you have to have seen a similar kind of image before. For instance, of your own son sleeping, and then that will evoke that image that is like the one you've seen will evoke the image in you. So the image can be used as an argument, but it's not an argument in itself. Is this what you're asking about?
Something like that. It's not so clear for me too. It's not so clear for me too how an image became logically part of an argument. I feel that this is an output of a process of argumentation, but I can't draw it in an exact way.
You know, often when we
it remains vague.
When we go to argumentation conferences, we often argue with people that say images cannot argue. And in one sense, they're right, but that's not what I'm saying. You could also say words cannot argue, but we can use words to argue. And that's what we do. We use images to argue. And we can evoke arguments in two ways. One is if you know about the situation. So if a picture like this one is presented in a specific situation with specific values, then people will decode it as argument. Or, for instance, if you have certain visual forms, tropes, figures that you can use to evoke arguments. So the point is pretty basic, really, that you use images to make an argument.
Okay. There is no time for more questions, but I guess that we'll be maybe at the conference dinner. Now we are going to have a 20 minutes coffee break just in Giustino Dorazio room on the right side, and then working groups will start. Thanks again, Jens.
Thank you.